Israeli forces struck the southern Gaza town of Rafah twice overnight as the IDF has moved its offensive against Hamas from the north to the south of Gaza. Critics and human rights organizations have criticized the southward movement of the IDF, given that the south is where many of those from the north sought refuge in the early stages of the war. So much so that UN officials have said there are no safe places left in the Gaza Strip, with the UN Secretary General warning of an impending humanitarian catastrophe. Joining us now to discuss the IDF's southward shift in their war against Hamas and the steps that are being taken to avoid civilian casualties is Lieutenant-Colonel Peter Lerner, spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Force. Lieutenant Lerner, thank you very much for joining us on Forum Daily.
Thank you, David.
When the IDF was fighting Hamas in the north, you notified pretty much everyone in every way possible to evacuate entire areas to the south. Now that the campaign has shifted to the south, how exactly is the IDF warning civilians in advance?
David, there's a distinct difference between the north and southern Gaza. The northern Gaza Strip is characterized by densely populated areas, but also densely populated with Hamas, with their Hamas capabilities and their centers of gravity. So it required a much vaster evacuation plan, indeed, to get people out of harm's way from a temporary perspective. But indeed, the idea is to get people out of harm's way so that the IDF could conduct its operations and engage and dismantle and destroy Hamas as a governing authority. As we've moved south, and indeed in the last 4 days, we've broadened the scope of our operations going down south. We have been able to differentiate further, learning from the lessons from the north, but also in a realization that the battleground itself is different. The characteristics of it are slightly different, and therefore the focused evacuation that we've conducted is much more elaborate and much more, I would say, very precise regarding to the centers of gravity of Hamas. We've said from the outset that the core goal or the two core goals of this war is, first of all, to dismantle and destroy Hamas as a governing authority and a terrorist entity, because they use that power of government to build their terrorist army. And second of all, to bring the hostages home. So Hamas, they operate in the north, but they also operate in the south. And that is why it was so necessary for us to continue our operations south.
And in terms of some of that precision in notifying civilians in the south, what exactly does that look like? And are civilians responding to the warnings? Because I ask that because we saw reporting in the north where Hamas was attempting to prevent people from fleeing.
Indeed, in the north, we saw an extensive effort by Hamas to prevent people from moving. First of all, by public announcements. They made public statements telling the people not to evacuate because the Israelis aren't really going to come to fight us. And that was the initial stage of their actions. Then they moved on to intimidation, telling people not to move or else. And thirdly, when all else failed, they actually erected physical barriers, checkpoints, to try and prevent them from going. And indeed, when the IDF mobilized into the Gaza Strip, into the north, when we reached the main road, the Salahuddin north to south route, we saw people that were relieved that our forces had reached there so that they could actually evacuate. And indeed, when we moved to our operations in the last 4 or 5 days now, alerting people that we intend to move, people have listened to us, have moved from the specific locations. The way we do it is via text message, via dropping leaflets. We have made direct phone calls, made phone call announcements, and also we have established a website in Arabic for the people of Gaza that can actually get updates on where they which neighborhoods should be moving from and where they should actually be moving to. We know that the website is successful because in a very short time, over 250,000 people in Gaza have accessed this website. And I would say that a vast majority of them, almost 70% of them, have actually accessed it by mobile phone. So we understand that people are not only getting the information, they're also acting on that information and are moving.
Lieutenant Lerner, before the break, I started the conversation about civilian casualties. A spokesman said earlier this week that a rough estimation of about 5,000 of the then 15,000 deaths were Hamas fighters. How does the IDF determine who is a Hamas fighter?
So first of all, I would say every civilian life lost in this war is a deep tragedy. Each and every one of those weighs on our shoulders as we are intending to move our war forward in order to achieve our goals. We operate based on the laws of armed conflict. We operate on the understanding that we need to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, between the terrorists and the civilians. And that is precisely why we encourage people to evacuate from combat zones. That is why we facilitate humanitarian access and the humanitarian mission and supplies to continue to go into Gaza. Indeed, this is a huge challenge. And I would say in the history of counterterrorism wars, there has never been a war fought in such circumstances in such a densely populated area. So this just reinforces our challenge and the challenge that we face. With regard to there is a core understanding that several thousands of terrorists have been killed in direct strikes from the air, from the sea, and also in combat on the ground. And indeed, the characteristics of the combat on the ground is extensive. And there is one very clear understanding that we're seeing as we face the terrorists. They're not facing us in battle dress. They are facing us in jeans, T-shirts, and sandals. They are not distinguishing themselves as combatants. They are distinguishing themselves as civilians. So even when we're killing them on the ground, they are being counted as civilians. So from our perspective, we are engaging the enemy. We are doing everything we can in order to limit the civilian strife caused by this war. But at the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves every single day, there is only a war because Hamas chose to launch the most brutal attack on Israel on the 7th of October, brutally massacring, abducting over 1,400 Israelis and foreign nationals. And we wouldn't be in this situation if it wasn't for that action. There is no other alternative but to fight Hamas because, and I'd say very clearly, they've said time and time again that given the opportunity, they would do the 7th of October once more. So from our perspective, it's not about the 7th of October. It's about preventing another 7th of October.
And I think a lot of people that certainly resonates with them, but they balance that with the concern over the civilians, which seems to be the real sticking point. We know that the goal is to eliminate Hamas. That presumably means that the military campaign will have to work throughout all of Gaza. What preparations is the IDF making for civilian safe zones for those civilians to flee to?
So we have designated a safer zone, a humanitarian zone on the south western part of the Gaza Strip. We've seen some people pitching up tents there, unfortunately not en masse, and the international humanitarian organizations aren't facilitating it, also because Hamas told them not to. And also yesterday, we saw rockets launched from in and around the humanitarian zone at Israel. So goes in line with Hamas's concept of operations: abuse all of the civilian components, put civilians at risk, and conduct their terrorism. We are operating in order to limit that. We're operating, and I would say, deeply understanding that the battleground is saturated with civilians. And as such, we need to conduct our operations in accordance to the international humanitarian law, to the laws of armed conflict, and limit the casualties. But it is a human tragedy that is developing before our eyes. We will continue our operations. We will defeat Hamas. We will dismantle and destroy it as a governing authority of the Gaza Strip. The tunnel network that they've established is the most vast, expensive, expansive construction project ever to be conducted in Gaza. Not for the benefit of the people of Gaza, but at the detriment of them, putting them at risk. They've said themselves, Hamas have said themselves, that the tunnels are not to serve the public to take cover. The tunnels are to serve the terrorists, and the UN needs to take care of the civilians. So in this reality, we have to continue our war. We have to continue it in a way that is in accordance to the laws of armed conflict. We have to spare civilians and do everything in our power in order to limit the civilian casualties and limit civilian strife that is a cause and a result of the war. But nevertheless, we are determined to defeat Hamas.
I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good day.